units, beginning with the respiratory system. Before I do so, I do know that looking at the syllabus, you're probably thinking, what do respiratory and urinary systems have to do with each other? Turns out they actually have quite a bit to do with each other in regards to regulation of pH, okay, which in fact is the last chapter that we will cover. So it turns out there is some unity in these three chapters. As far as the respiratory system itself goes, it's there to handle a single issue inside of the body, which is that in order to deliver enough energy within the cell to keep up the activity that we require of the cells, we have to rely on aerobic respiration. Okay, remember that's the process by which we have oxygen being used by a mitochondria to take a food molecule and turn it into lots of ATP. Okay, the idea is that all of that oxygen has to come out of the blood, but ultimately we have to have something to put it into the bloodstream so that the heart can pump it and deliver it. And that something is the respiratory system. All right, so the idea is that we see this respiratory system primarily as a way of supporting the energy needs of the body by supplying that oxygen gas. And oh, by the way, getting rid of the waste product, the CO2, it allows us to give the body the chance to have enough energy to grow, to maintain itself, and to do all of the activities that we tend to see. All right, now, the interesting thing about oxygen is that we are definitely going to think about wanting to move it from place to place, but it turns out that at no point in the body can we actually drag it or push it or pull it anywhere. We are going to see the movement of oxygen primarily through diffusion. Okay, the idea is that we have to diffuse the oxygen from the air through the membranes of the lung into the blood. It has to then diffuse out of the blood across the cell membranes into the tissue to where it can be used. And the carbon dioxide has to make that opposite trip. Okay, again, the idea is that we're relying on diffusion. We will see cases where we're really maximizing the likelihood of diffusion occurring by the way we set up structures and the way we alternate flows. Right. Now, the thing about this diffusion is that, for one thing, we maximize the rate at which it can occur by having the membrane that is going to allow it to enter from the air into our blood be as thin as possible. Okay? In other words, it's going to be incredibly thin and therefore incredibly delicate. The other thing that happens is that in order to supply enough oxygen, we need a whole lot of this membrane. If we were to have this membrane on the outside of us, okay, kind of sailing behind us like a little parasail behind us or a little kite, it would be basically about a tennis court's worth of material behind us. We can't have it outside of us, though, simply because outside there are lots of things that could get into it. Dirt, dust, debris, mechanical injury. Okay, so what we want to do instead is take all of this huge respiratory membrane, which again is big but really thin, and we want to package it into something that will protect it. That is the purpose of the lungs. Okay, the lungs are essentially a way of allowing you to keep the all-important respiratory membrane in a place where it's still usable, still lets you get air down into it and to exchange the gases. Okay, but at the same time that you can protect it, okay, that it's very difficult to mechanically rip it, that it's very difficult for pathogens to make it all that way, right, and then to get into the body. All right. As far as functionality goes then, we could really say that job number one is really what happens at the respiratory membranes, the exchange of the gases. So oxygen going from the air into the bloodstream, and CO2 coming out of the bloodstream and going into the air. Number two, because we are bearing those exchange membranes in our body, in the lungs, we have to have a set of systems that allows us to exchange air. In other words, to take air from out here, move it down to those respiratory surfaces, and then have a way of getting it back out. Okay? So that too is a function of the respiratory system. 3, as part of keeping you alive, those passageways that allow that movement also need to make sure that we can protect that membrane by having some defensive functions. So that if there is a pathogenic or simply just dangerous material in the air that you breathe in, that you have a way of removing it before it gets to the really delicate surfaces. Okay, so without a doubt, functions 1, 2, and 3, you have to have in order to continue to be a healthy adult human. All right. Functions 4 and 5, though, are simply things that we can take advantage of, but they are not strictly necessary for life. Okay? Such as number 4, the movement of the air through those passageways. We can harness that movement to produce sound. Okay? I make my living out of that, as maybe many of you will at some point. Okay? You're going to talk maybe to patients or doctors or whatever that be able to communicate. All right. Now the deal is that you can live without that. Right? But it is something that is a useful sort of adaptation of the system. By the same token, our sense of smell works better than it otherwise would, simply because every time you inspire, that is to say breathe in, inhale, you are potentially moving those little odorants past those receptors so that you can transmit that information. This sense of smell simply works better because of that movement of air. All right. Now, in regards to the respiratory system itself, it is very often divided up in 2 separate ways. The first way is what's mentioned here. So the first way to divide this system up is by upper and lower respiratory systems. Okay, the borderline that is going to serve as you cross this, you're in the one versus the other, is the top of the larynx. Okay, if you are superior to the larynx, you are in the upper respiratory system. From the top of the larynx down, that is the lower respiratory system. Okay, the reason why that is the boundary is simply because that is where you go from having a common passageway. Common means that it's okay if air, food, and drink are in the same tube, to a dedicated air passageway. Okay, which means that the only thing that should be there is just air. Okay, so above the larynx in the upper respiratory system, if you have food and drink in there, if you are drinking milk and someone tells a joke and you snort the milk out, sure, it's embarrassing, but you're not going to die from it. Right? You literally cannot die from embarrassment. They proved it. Okay, I just want you to know that. But the idea is that if, on the other hand, you were to actually draw some of that milk through the larynx into the trachea and then into the lungs, well, that's a different story. Okay? If you aspirate that milk, that could be life-threatening, because milk or any other substance should not be in that lower respiratory system. Now, having said all of that, where you probably heard those terms is basically through infection. We're going into fall and winter, right? People are starting to get the sniffles. When people come in, they are often told they have a upper respiratory infection, right? The idea being that the infection is centered in one of these areas. So here's just the visual to go along with this. They nicely point out, both with the line and then a little dotted line, the border. Okay, above that line represents the upper respiratory system. And yeah, food, air, water, liquid of some sort, all of it's okay. Below the line, so from larynx on down, the only thing you should have there is just air. The other way to break up the respiratory system is by conducting versus respiratory. Okay, so conducting portion, respiratory portion. The idea with conducting portion is that it is all of the areas where air is simply moving through. So in other words, this is an area where it's basically a tube where things are simply moving through and no gas exchange occurs. The respiratory portion is actually going to be just that area where you can move oxygen and CO2 through the membrane into and out of the airspace. If you break down the respiratory system in this way, then the conducting portion is actually going to include all of the upper and most of the lower respiratory system, because it's only at the very end of these branching pathways that you finally get to the respiratory portion, where you can do gas exchange. So, again, just keep in mind, conducting portion, that is the area where air is simply moving through. Respiratory portion, where you can actually do gas exchange. All right. Now, one of the things that is definitely going to allow the respiratory portion to do the gas exchange is that this is the area where you have the respiratory membrane, where you've got an area where there is an extremely thin epithelial layer that is going to have a relatively small areolar tissue layer that is going to ensure that you can actually exchange portions. Okay, that's different than when you're looking in the conducting portion, where your epithelial layer is going to be much thicker, okay, more protective, where the areolar tissue is a much larger amount. Okay, to give you an example of that difference, here is a part of the conducting portion where what you're going to see is the ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Okay, remember that mouthful from 165, right? The idea here is that this is an area where the emphasis is on protection simply because there is no exchange occurring. Air is simply passing by the epithelial layer, and you do not have to get air across, or oxygen, CO2 across. Okay. Here is the example. Okay. Again, the idea is that this would line, as it happens, your upper respiratory system, different portions of it at least, would line your trachea. The thing about this barrier is that there are plenty of goblet cells that are assisted by other glands, all of them producing mucus, right? And the idea with all of this mucus is that it provides this thick, kind of sticky material that would actually capture dirt, dust, debris, pathogens that might be hitching a ride in that air, so that you can in fact trap it and then through the action of the cilia direct it to where it can be disposed of, so that it never actually gets down to the respiratory membrane. Again, for the lamina propria, that's where the areolar tissue is located, underneath the epithelium. The idea is we do see lots of these mucus glands simply assisting in that production of mucus. Guys, it's one of those deals where we definitely want lots and lots of mucus to catch all of this material. It is worth noting that it is in the lamina propria, where in the lower respiratory system, we can also see some smooth muscle cells. The idea being that it's these muscle cells that are going to allow us to control the actual size of that conducting portion, okay, near the terminus of that system. For the part that is going to be the epithelium in the respiratory portion, okay, mainly we're going to look in the alveoli, okay, but the idea is that it would be roughly akin to that in the respiratory bronchiole as well. What you want is an epithelium that is as thin as is possible. What we're going to see is extremely thin, simple squamous epithelium. The idea is that by having such a thin layer, this is, especially when it's connected to a capillary, going to provide a minimal sort of barrier for those gases to cross. Okay, so you have really thin epithelial cells. And if you look, you'll notice that inside of this epithelial cell, okay, they're not showing you the nucleus of the epithelial cell, but they are showing the nucleus of the endothelial cell. That's the cell of the capillary. Notice that the nucleus is actually about as big as both of these two cells combined. Okay, so it's a really very thin layer.
When you say respiratory too, all of these tissues are found in the upper and the lower?
Okay, this one is going to be found in the respiratory portion.
Oh, not the conducting portion.
Not the conducting portion. The conducting portion is where you expect to see the pseudostratified ciliated epithelium.
Gotcha. Okay.
All right, to give you an idea about how thin this is, if you look at the walls of the alveoli, they are less than a micron in thickness. Okay, the idea being, the less you put between the airspace of the alveoli and the blood traveling through the capillary, the greater the rate that oxygen will enter into the blood, and the greater the rate at which CO2 will leave. Okay, so having super thin walls is going to facilitate that. Because again, we cannot push oxygen, we cannot pull on it. All we can do is set it up so that diffusion works as efficiently as possible. All right, now again with the respiratory epithelium, it is worth noting that these very thin membranes, there are a lot of them packed away in the lungs. When we talk about the alveolar structure, the idea is they are found clustered in these sacs, and there are a lot of these sacs inside of the lungs. Again, if you were to actually spread them all out, you would see a surface area about 35 times the surface area of the body itself. That is a huge amount. Okay? And again, it's simply because you need that much to get an adequate amount of oxygen coming in and CO2 coming out. It is worth noting that because that respiratory epithelium, okay, the idea, the alveoli sort of epithelium is so thin, you really do have to protect it. Okay, part of that we accomplish with the respiratory defense system. Okay, the idea is effectively these are filtration areas that are helping to remove material out of the air before they get down to those really thin, delicate walls. Okay. We've actually already seen some of this. So in the trachea, in the upper respiratory system, where you see that combination of the pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium plus all the goblet cells, all that stuff making mucus, that's defense. That's allowing you to trap and to remove all of that bad stuff before it can get down to those very thin walled alveoli. Okay, as far as what's in the trachea, by the way, we would technically call that arrangement the mucus escalator. Which doesn't that sound like a fun ride? Mommy, I want to ride the mucus escalator.
You know I gotta ride that, right?
Yeah, I know, right?
That's how you do it.
Yeah. Now, as it happens, the idea here is that this is going to help direct all of that material away from those very delicate alveoli and up to where you can either just simply swallow it into the GI system or you can hack it out. And either way, please do note that that's away from the delicate alveoli. So yeah, it might be kind of gross if someone hacks out something, but they're protecting their lungs. Okay, that mucus has protected their lungs because maybe this is an infectious bacteria that if it got down there would cause a huge amount of problems. Okay. Please don't forget that in our nasal cavity, we are also going to see the removal of a lot of material. Some of it based upon the fact that we have very narrow passageways. And we know they're narrow because in the winter, fall and winter, they sometimes get clogged up, right? The idea, though, is the very narrow passageways with all the mucus that are there help to filter some of that original air coming in. I know it's kind of gross, but the hairs inside of your nose here, okay, especially when they get covered in mucus, they too serve as a really good filtration system. Okay? At the very bottom of this system, down in the alveoli, it is worth noting that there is at least a bit of defense down there, I should say, and that there is a macrophage type that lives in the alveoli, and that it can phagocytize material. Now, this macrophage is good at helping to take out bacteria, so it can fight bacteria and other organic material that gets down there. But what it's less capable of dealing with are some of the particulate matters that can get into the alveoli. The example that probably most everybody knows, asbestos. Asbestos is actually this, it's kind of like a fiberglass sort of material. Okay, it's this kind of sharp, very tiny fragment that if it gets down there, the macrophage will try to phagocytize it, but it can't actually get rid of it. And that asbestos sitting there is going to cause damage, and they'll have to do replacement of the cells, and over time it can actually lead to those ever-increasing number of cells becoming either cancerous or simply becoming malfunction. Okay? So it leads to an issue in lung function. So having said that about the epithelium, what I'd like to do is do a guided tour of the respiratory system. And we are, in fact, going to start at the nose. By the way, what you will not see in this tour, at least not directly, is the oral cavity. Okay, because when it comes to the respiratory system, the oral cavity, while it can be recruited into providing extra air, is not ideal. It is not considered to be part of your normal respiratory system that you should use. And it has very much to do with the fact that your nose has lots of mechanisms to try to protect you. If air is breathed in through the mouth, most of those protections are gone. Okay? You get to bypass all of those defenses and go straight to the pharynx and onto the larynx. Okay? It's part of the reason why if you are in an area where there's a lot of smoke, dust, and debris, you shouldn't be breathing through your mouth. Okay? You should be breathing through your nose. Okay? If you are outside and it's really cold, okay, don't breathe through your mouth because you'll experience a very painful burning sensation in your lungs, right, because of all the cold air. You need for it to come through your nose. Now, having said that, why is it that you can breathe through your mouth?
Because it's still connected.
It's definitely still connected. And why would you maybe want to use it? Well, the nose is stopped up. That's definitely the case. And you guys can probably notice my nose isn't exactly open.
To release CO2?
Well, definitely to release CO2, but the nose works to do that too. So how about this? We all want to go do the stairs? No? Okay, I love that answer. No. All right. But if we all did the stairs,
Increased oxygen.
there you go. The idea is that everybody could probably go up the stairs, maybe breathing through your nose, but by the time you go back down and back up, most of us are going to have to start breathing through our mouth simply because we need more air coming in and out than our nose alone can supply. Okay? So it's kind of one of those things that can be recruited in, but you really should only do so if the nose is not capable of keeping up with the demand. All right. All that being said, do you want to start with the nose? It is going to begin with the external nares, what we commonly call the nostrils. That's what leads into the nasal vestibule. All right, the best way to figure out what is nasal vestibule and not, take a finger and thumb, pinch your nose. What you just pinched, that's the nasal vestibule. That's it. Okay. The idea is that one of the more prominent features of the nasal vestibule is nasal hairs. And while it may be a little bit gross, especially when they get to be in excess, the truth is that nasal hairs, especially when they get covered in mucus, are actually a very effective way of filtering some of the larger particles out of the air. If you've ever cut grass when it's been kind of dusty, and at the end of you cutting grass, you sneeze out a huge amount of dirt, okay, I know it's gross, right? But the deal is that dirt, it's in the handkerchief instead of in your lungs. And that's helping to protect you, okay? The idea is that if you get past the nasal vestibule, you will enter into the nasal cavity. Okay, the nasal cavity is what you would have stared at if you were examining the bones of the skull. Remember how you looked at the perpendicular plate coming out of the bottom of the ethmoid and where it met the vomer? Looking at that, you were looking at the nasal cavity, because that's what is to either side of it. Because it turns out that those bones are part of the nasal septum. Okay, in a living individual with all their stuff intact, the nasal septum is part, those bones, perpendicular plate of the ethmoid, the vomer, but also part cartilage. And the idea with this nasal septum is it's there to provide a wall between the two different halves of the nasal cavity to actually restrict the passage of air. It's intentional. We want to restrict it. All right. Now, it is worth noting that this nasal septum, it is covered with mucosa, just like the rest of the nasal cavity is, and all of these sections produce copious amounts of mucus. Okay, the idea being that all that mucus is there to catch any particulate matter that comes in. All right. Now, the idea with that cavity is to further enhance the amount of mucosa and therefore the amount of mucus that is being produced. We actually see that there are these 3 bony extensions. You may also remember that from looking in the skull. These are called the conchae. And the deal is that these conchae, because of their length and the fact that they get really close to the septum, they actually set up these 3 different tunnels, or actually a couple, 4 different tunnels now I think about it. The idea is that the superior middle and inferior conchae give rise to superior middle and inferior meatuses. Meatuses are just the tunnels. All right, so this is showing you half of the nasal cavity where the septum's been removed. You can see the conchae there creating the tunnels that go between. The idea is that when air flows through those tunnels, it does not get to flow straight. Each of those tunnels actually sets up almost like a vortex, where instead of air going just straight through the tunnel, it tends to corkscrew around and around inside the tunnel. Okay, now the purpose of doing that is that the extra time that the air spinning around inside of a meatus, is extra time for the air to become warmer. Like when you went out this morning, and it was cold, 36 degrees. I stood in it way too long this morning waiting to vote. All right, the idea is that that's really cold air. And if I breathe through my nose and it spends time just spinning around in the meatus, it can pick up warmth from my body. If I were to breathe straight through my mouth, I'd bypass most of that warming time. And it would have been cold on my lungs. All right, the idea is that as I'm spinning around in there, I can also pick up the moisture from the mucus so that it becomes much more humid. Because having a humid air makes it much easier on those very thin-walled alveoli. So the humidity increase is a good thing. It makes it easier on the respiratory portion. All right, the idea is that all of the extra spinning is also going to buy time for heavier particular matter to fall out. Because gravity is going to catch them. And even if gravity doesn't catch them, all of the extra spinning just increases the likelihood that it's going to end up against the wall where I've got that sticky mucus. So I get trapped in the sticky mucus. All right. And then finally, all the spinning there is going to increase the likelihood that some of that material is going to pass by the receptors at the top of my nasal cavity so that I can actually smell the material that's in the air. Now, part of making these meatuses work is that there is a restriction of airflow in any other direction. And that includes not allowing air coming through your nose to be able to take a shortcut into the oral cavity. So in order to make this work most efficiently, you need a wall separating the nasal from the oral cavities. And most people have an intact wall. It's formed from the combination of hard palate. Remember, that's the palatine process of the maxilla bone and the palatine bones, with the soft tissue over that. And then the soft palate, which is no bone and just soft tissue. Okay, the idea is those two things in combination are going to ensure that air doesn't get to make a shortcut. For those that are born without a complete wall, cleft palate, cleft lip in the more extreme version, they actually can breathe through their nose, but they get a bypassing of most of their meatuses. Because if they've got a big gap through their palates, the air simply goes down into the oral cavity. So they are actually prone to a greater risk of respiratory infections and the like, simply because their nose doesn't work like it's supposed to. Okay. All right. Where your meatuses end, we technically say that that is the internal nares. So there is an internal nare at the end of each meatus. And as soon as you have passed out of those internal nares, you have entered into a portion of the pharynx called the nasopharynx. Now remember that the pharynx itself is going to be a three-part chamber that is a shared passageway. It's part respiratory, part digestive. You can have air, food, and drink in here, and it's no problem. The idea is that it will consist of the portion behind the nasal cavity. That's the nasopharynx. And if you're looking for the endpoint, the nasopharynx ends where the soft palate is. Because from the soft palate down to where you just stop being able to see, so like if you're checking the back of